Welcome back, Honors. All right, welcome back to your first flip of this new week, right? This new virtual school week where we're not only learning, reviewing, but we are reading as well, right? We're getting into our All Quiet on the Western Front. You should have finished up Chapter 1 by now. There is a Chapter 1 chapter quiz on Google Classroom today. You can do it before this, after this. It's really up to y'all. It's mainly there just to check that you're reading effectively, and that you're kind of engaging with the material and stuff like that. So please get excited about it. I love this book. Please don't disrespect it. But we're also now amidst World War I. We went through all the causes. We talked about the family connectedness of Kaiser Wilhelm II and his cousin Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and George V of England. We talked about the leaders, the allies, right, the alliances that were formed following the failout of Otto von Bismarck's League of Three Emperors. We talked about the growth of militarism and industrialism and how that's going to affect everything. Imperialism, the Anglo-German arms race. We talked about Pan-Slavism, nationalism, how that plays into everything. We talked about the Balkan state being like the powder keg that it was because of Pan-Slavism. And we finally talked about the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That was the kind of match which lit the fuse, which ignited this bomb that was World War I. All right? So we're now getting into it, and the craziest part about it that y'all notice is that as of the last flip, World War I's getting started off in a very crazy way. Somebody gets shot. It takes a month for them to decide to finally get things handled, because I don't know if you noticed, but in June, late June, is when the Archduke went to visit Bosnia and Sarajevo. And war wasn't declared until July 28th, 1914. Let me double check that date just to be safe, but I'm pretty confident it's correct. Austria declares war on Serbia on July 28th. Yeah, July 28th. It took them a whole month to get that handled because Kaiser Wilhelm had to go on vacation for 3 weeks where he couldn't be reached. And they had to figure this stuff out. They talked about the blank check. We talked about the July crisis. But where we left off, the following powers are in the fight. As of July, the following powers are involved. You've got the Austrians, the Serbians, who weren't even really going to be able to fight. They didn't have as much of a standing army as you would like to think. The Austrians, the Russians, the Germans, and now the French, okay? Britain, still not involved yet. They're trying to hold out. They're trying to let this be a localized small war. The problem is it's not going to be like that. But here's the thing. If you're looking at this map... stop it. If you're looking at this map over here real quick, as we'll come back to here in a second, if you're Germany, you're at an obvious disadvantage. Just make sure we're recording. You're at an obvious disadvantage. You are located centrally in the continent of Europe, and you are smack dab between two of the historically strongest countries that Europe had ever seen. On your east is Russia, who has one of the biggest militaries in the continent. And then on your west is France, historically the strongest military in the entire continent, because they had the Napoleonic militaries, and then they had the second French Empire militaries under Napoleon III. They were historically the biggest and baddest group in all of continental Europe. But here's the thing. You're Germany. Germany, by this point in history, Germany, by this point in history, has the largest military in continental Europe. As of 1871, getting into this point we're talking about now, Germany is a baby. They've only been around for 40 years. 40 years, right? 40 years. That's it. But they spent that 40 years gathering all of the German-speaking people together, taxing them effectively, building up their industry, growing to be a powerhouse, and shoveling a lot of that money into their military. You have to understand, percentage-wise, most of your other European countries spent anywhere from 15 to 30% on their military, right? Or in expenditure increases anyway. They spent 15 to 30% more on their military in the years leading up to World War I. Germany, on the other hand, spent 73% more in the years leading up to World War I. They were involved in the Anglo-British or the Anglo-German arms race. They were involved in the race of trying to see who can build the most boats. Dreadnought versus Unterseeboot. All right, so the thing about it, Germany is militarily very prepared for this war. They are ready to fight it. They have a lot of technology that not a lot of people know exists yet. They've got these big artillery guns that we'll talk about later on. They have more machine guns than anybody else in continental Europe, aka the Maxim gun. So their plan is right now, how do we fight a war when we're centrally located on this continent? And they turn to their books and they see this thing called the Schlieffen Plan. Now, Schlieffen Plan, invented by a guy named Alfred von Schlieffen, who is one of the old generals of Germany after 1871 when they were actually became. He was a Prussian general who becomes one of the first German generals when they unify together in 1871. And Alfred Schlieffen, working closely with Otto von Bismarck before he got fired by Wilhelm II, said if we ever were to get into a war with, like, the rest of the continent of Europe, right? Because he had to plan ahead. Otto von Bismarck saw the alliances crumbling. He watched Wilhelm not approve the League of Three Emperors, sending Russia to the curb when they allied with France. So you're not going to spend 20 years being like, oh, well, what if we go to war? We'll worry about it later. You're going to worry about it then. So all the way back into the late 1890s, Alfred von Schlieffen, one of the German military leaders, said the best way to fight this war, if it ever happens, we got to go through Belgium and Holland, Holland being southern Netherlands. We got to sweep through them with 90, I say it again, 90% of the German military force. And we got to show up on the backside of Paris, and we got to swarm them, and then we take them over, and we knock France out of this war quick, all right? They knock them out real fast, like this.
What is the five fingers say to the face? What? Slap!
So the thing about it, though, it didn't actually work. And some of y'all are like, well, why didn't you just go through here? Well, you see these little blue castles right there? The Franco-German border is heavily fortified. Heavily fortified. So they can't go through the southern area, so they were like, let's just sweep through Belgium. But why do I have Belgium with 2 stars around it? Belgium's neutral. You can't just roll up through Belgium. Now, granted, the Germans did ask first. The Germans were like, hey, Belgium, do you mind if we sweep through your country really fast just to go attack France real quick? It's going to be real fast. Belgium was like, no, you may not. You cannot do that because we are a neutral country and we are not going to condone any of these militaristic actions. And the Germans were like, I'm sorry, what? And they were already on their way anyway. So when they entered into Belgium on August 4th, 1914, Britain is then going to declare war. That's how they got involved, because Germany invaded neutral Belgium. And Belgium tried to put up a fight, too. And, like, they actually held the Germans back for several weeks, and it actually prevented them from sweeping through like they had planned. But also the reason why is because Germany didn't use 90% of the force like Alfred von Schlieffen told them that they were supposed to. The reason being is because Alfred von Schlieffen was already dead. Alfred von Schlieffen died in 1913. He made this strategy in preparation for a large war, if you ever had to fight Russia and France at the same time. But the thing was, he died in 1913. And the guys, the generals that followed him, were not prepared to fight this war. One of them, historically very famous, Ludendorff. Ludendorff limited the number down from 90 to closer to about 70, 65%, which is another reason why this failed. And then it also failed because they got held up in certain spots. And it also failed because France mobilized a lot faster than they ever expected them to. And it also failed because the Belgians tried to blow up a bunch of railroad tracks that the Germans were going to use on their way. So they got slowed down. For this plan to have ever worked in the first place, I'm not choking up Alfred von Schlieffen to be the guy that could have saved this war or whatever. It wasn't going to work in the first place because everything would have had to work perfectly leading up to this. Now here's the other irony too. Speaking of these generals, so dumb, all right? So, like, these generals were not with the times, if you will, okay? And we'll talk about this a little bit more here in a few minutes. But, like, these generals wanted to try and fight this war the way wars have been fought for years and years and years. Fix bayonets, charge at each other, use artillery on an elevated surface, cavalry. That wins the day, a man on a horse. And a lot of that has to do with socioeconomics. Who is the guy on the back of a horse? The guy who can afford a horse. Who can afford a horse? The rich people. Who are the rich people? The officers. The officers are heavily entrenched in the military tradition, blah, 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 blah. I can teach this for days, all right? And I can get into the socioeconomic inequality of European military structure, but we don't have that kind of time, all right? So what's going to end up happening, though, is Germany wanted to avoid that two-front war with the Schlieffen Plan, but the Schlieffen Plan obviously failed. And they end up with two fronts anyway. The Western Front being in northern France, and it's going to stretch all the way down to the Mediterranean. It's 440 miles long. All right, we'll get into that later. And then there's the Eastern Front. It was almost 3 times as long as the Western Front. We'll talk about that also a little bit later. Just know that it's about 3 times as long as the Western Front, which is going to start in Germany and Austria, and it's going to get pushed all the way back into Russia. So going forward, though, don't worry. It's going to be over by Christmas. You are so flippin' wrong. All right, so this is another massive, 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 massive inconvenient truth of World War I. This was the mentality of the soldiers entering into World War I. Smiles, happy faces, and excitement. And you saw this in Chapter 1 of All Quiet on the Western Front. The Iron Youth, right? Their schoolmaster, Cantoric. I just gave you all an answer to that quiz. Their schoolmaster, Cantoric, writing that letter to Albert Kropp, saying like, oh, you are the Iron Youth. You're the ones who will save the fatherland. Blah, 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 blah. Patriotism. What a joke, all right? Like, so, because these are all 18, 19-year-old kids who are going off to fight a war that no one ever saw coming. A war full of weaponry that can fire 600 bullets per minute. That's 10 shots a second. And it only takes one of them to kill you. That's insane. Now, not every time. A lot of people are wounded and they don't actually die from the first shot. That's me being exaggerating. But still, like, these are young men going off to fight in the war. These young men care more about talking to these girls than they do, or than they should, about this war. But they have been built up for years, for decades, to go off and fight a war that they believe their country demands, and it believes that they will make them a man. They believe that it will be the defining characteristic of their life to go off and win this war against the bad guys. Who are the bad guys in this war? No one's committing gross atrocities yet. Who is more right or wrong? Why is this is literally started. This war makes me so mad, okay? This war makes me mad because it's not like World War II. World War II had villains, legitimate villains. We'll talk about one of them here in a little bit. That were people that were committing genocide and atrocities. And I'm not saying that that didn't happen in World War I, because it did. There was the rape of Belgium, which was a huge event where German soldiers executed huge numbers of Belgians that resisted the German sweep through during the Schlieffen Plan. There were massive atrocities. There were massacres that Russians committed against Germans in like the East Prussia area. There's a lot of bad things about this war, but there was no true bad guy at the very, very beginning. And if you were going to call anybody a bad guy, why not call the guy that shot somebody a bad guy? And he's a Serbian who was going to be an ally. So, like, who's the bad guy? Nobody's the bad guy. This war is crazy because it started by a bunch of really angry kings that are just mad. You know, they're just mad. They just want to prove their dominance. And this is that nationalistic tension just bubbling up. And it's these boys that are going out to fight this war that should be in school, not like, sorry, I could rant about this for days. So, and like, look at this. This picture is very, very big deal. This is young men from Germany going off to the front lines. Our narrator, Paul Baumer, could be inside this train car with all of his friends. And they're writing things on the side of the boxcar that say, "Auf Flug nach Paris." All right, so, or Flug nach Paris. Now, it's not going to say France, because that's Frankreich. But, like, in German, that means, I'll see you in Paris, or a trip to Paris. They're going on a trip to Paris. And it says, Auf Wiedersehen, which is goodbye, from the boulevard. All right? And I guess this must be, like, where they're coming from. And then it just is this idea that they're going off to fight on a trip. That this is, like, they're happy. They're excited about a war that's going to claim the lives of not just 10 million soldiers, but upwards of 20 million civilians. It's crazy. It's absolutely nuts. So, and this is also a new kind of war. getting back into what we were talking about, World War I is very different from any war that ever came before it. World War I is the first modern war. It's the first war of the modern era. So we got to beg the question really quick, well, how was war then fought before World War I? Well, if you're looking at Napoleonic War, which I'm throwing up some pictures of Napoleonic War tactics on the screen right now. This is what war looked like before World War I. You had mostly single-shot muskets that the best in the world could fire twice per minute. You had huge charges on the backs of cavalry, which is a horse, like actual horsemen. You had very bright, vibrant uniforms, bayonets, charges in open field. Cannons are now making their way onto the scene. But it's an obvious, very open war thing. And also, looking at those wars that we just took a look at, the Napoleonic Wars, the Franco-Prussian War, things of that nature, those wars were localized. They were small, and they only really lasted a few months. That's why everybody thought that, oh, this will be over by Christmas. Like, no. If they wanted to look at a war that was going to be much more like effective for them to study to figure out how to forecast this war coming down the pipe, they should have looked at the American Civil War. And I know if I've got any parents that are big-time historians listening to this right now, they're like, yeah, they should have looked at that. Yeah, 1861 to 1865, claimed the lives of 500,000 Americans, right? It was a stalemate war. It was long, drug out, periods of great boredom, followed by periods of mass, violence and huge numbers of death. And what I mean by boredom is just, the giant gaps of time between the battles, okay? Now, that's how war was fought before World War I. But World War I is going to be a lot scarier because it's going to be dominated by a strategy known as trench warfare on the Western Front. All right, you need to write that down next to trench warfare, that it was mainly on the Western Front. So, because it's all quiet on the Western Front. Now, anyway, World War I will be dominated by a strategy known as trench warfare, and it's the major theme of the war. When you think World War I, you think trench warfare. It's just kind of what immediately comes to mind. Of any historian, of any person, is what comes to mind immediately. The opposing sides attack and defend from these deep trenches, and in the middle of them is this area called no man's land, which we'll get into what that looks like here in a couple minutes, okay? The opposing sides are going to storm no man's land, attack from either side, and in the middle of no man's land is going to be planes, the dead bodies of the dead, barbed wire, which was invented, I think, in 1874? No. 1867. I was like, what? How far off am I? 8 years? All right, so, well, anyway, so barbed wire littering no man's land, this giant mess of stuff, is going to be the defining characteristics of World War I. Now, it wasn't particularly like that in the colonies of Africa. That was much more open area fighting. The areas of the Middle East, that's more like open area fighting as well. Eastern Front. So, trench warfare didn't even take place in most of the war, but most of your casualties and the worst battles all happened on the Western Front that claimed the most lives. The Battle of the Somme claimed over 1 million people. But why? Why trench warfare? Why did they dig underground? Why was this Western Front, which claimed the most deaths out of everybody, well, not the most, because the Eastern Front claimed a lot of Russian lives. You understand what I'm saying. But why? Why trenches? Why is that going to be the dominant understanding of war going into World War I? Well, there's a recent invention that can make war very horrific, and it happens to be the Maxim machine gun, right? The 600-round firing per minute weapon is going to be the thing that forces the hand of trench warfare on the way during this war. Now, this is what you think of probably when you immediately think of trench warfare. That's inaccurate, though. That's a picture from World War II. And you can tell this is from World War II because of the uniform the men are wearing, because of the rounded helmets, okay? The rounded helmets are actually indicative of World War II, okay? So this area as well, this is not what the trenches actually looked like. When you think trench, you think long ditch, straight ahead, very simple. And also the tanks in the back are World War II tanks. Those are Sherman tanks, actually, American Sherman tanks. Now, the problem is this is what World War I actually looked like. The trenches were actually these big like zigzags, and it depended on what side you were fighting on. If they were really, really nice trenches or really, really garbage trenches. French trenches and British trenches were really, really gross because they didn't think they were going to be there that long. And the German trenches, on the other hand, were super well done. They had like wooden floors, and some had dugouts with running water and electricity ran to them, and telegraph wires that went all over the place and stuff like that. So a lot of it is like this war is just very crazy and intense, okay? No one was prepared for the machine gun. Nobody. Not a single soul was prepared for the machine gun. Because, like I said before, generals thought that they were going to be fighting this war on the backs of horses still. The earliest battles, the ones that incorporated the Schlieffen Plan, like the ones that were a result of this big sweep through Belgium and Holland and to try and come on the backside of France, are going to be things like the First Battle of the Marne and the Race for the Sea. All right, so the First Battle of the Marne is going to be the first major engagement that sees trench warfare in action, okay? And here's a photograph, actually, from the First Battle of the Marne. Now, notice there are no trenches yet. These are German soldiers. You can tell that from the little spikes on their helmets, okay? The earliest German foot soldiers actually had these little, like, spikes on their helmets. However, Paul Baumer and our guys that we're talking about in All Quiet on the Western Front. Hi, love. What time is it?
2 minutes.
Okay, cool. We're going to be making a departure here in like 2 seconds. But anyway, Paul Baumer and our guys would have been wearing a different style German helmet by this point. They would have been wearing a German helmet that looks like this. So as you can see, it's like a little bit smoother, like flicks up in the back. So uniforms actually evolved through World War I. In 1914, Austro-Hungarian horsemen actually wore super bright green tunics up top and like bright red pants and stuff like that. And the French wore bright red pants and a very bright blue jacket. But they found out later on that with a machine gun, it's a lot easier to see, and they will easily shoot you with a machine gun because you're wearing bright colors. So they're going to change over time. But as you can see in this particular photograph from the First Battle of the Marne, the uniforms are a little bit different. But also there is no trench, all right? There's no trench because this was evident that the Germans got held up by the French, and they actually had to retreat. And when they retreated, they actually did what was called digging in. Now, when they dug in literally. They literally broke their shovels out and created the first trenches to avoid machine gun fire. Now, in their original retreat, the French actually gobbled up like 100 of their machine guns and would eventually use them against them. Now, then there was the Race for the Sea, which these are the original Battle of the Marne lines where they actually dug the original trenches in. Now, then the Germans are going to start trying to outflank the French by trying to go up and then try to flank over and go up and try to flank over. But as that kept happening, they would go up and try to flank over, but the French would meet them and turn them back. And then they would try to go higher again, and then they would meet them and turn them back. And so it was like a race for the sea is what they called it, heading towards the English Channel. All right, so there we go. These trenches, the first trenches that were actually dug at the First Battle of the Marne, because when the Germans retreated, when their Schlieffen Plan failed, they started digging in, right, to avoid machine gun fire. So just so you understand, you dig the trench so you can get underneath the machine gun fire, okay? Because if a machine gun is letting off 600 rounds per minute, you need to be able to hide underneath to let those bullets go over top of your head so you can then choose to pop up and actually fight from a safe, protected point. So these first trenches, though, that were dug at the Battle of the Marne and during the Race for the Sea, are going to eventually then extend southward and be over 440 miles long. A trench network of 440 miles. It's wild, all right? It's absolutely wild when I try to think about that. These trenches went for 440 miles. And these are just some imagery of World War I. These are some pictures, some stills, just to kind of give you a little bit more things to work with, right? Some interior emotional standpoint while you're reading your book, so you can know how to imagine these things. These are Austrian leaders on their horses. They're like, this will be the thing that wins the war. This war started on these and it ends in these. All right. So as you can tell, the tank would be the thing that replaces the horse, because a horse is going to get shot out from under you if you ride across a field with your bright uniform on, you idiots. Now, this is what I'm talking about. These generals of this war were so stupid early on because they thought that, oh, this would just be like any other war we've ever fought. It's not a big deal. The cavalry has always won. They've always been the thing that saved the day in every single war that we've ever fought in the past. The cavalry destroyed Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. The cavalry ran people down in sub-Saharan Africa. It ain't gonna be like that anymore, you idiot. The other, like, group has just as many big weapons as you do now. Ugh! So this war started on horses, ends in tanks. We gotta move real quick. Sorry about that, guys. We had to migrate out to the love seat. The wife's got yoga going on right now. Are the girls allowed to come to the yoga?
Always.
So if you go ahead and go over to Vitamin Ree and you check out her yoga post, if you would like to do yoga with Vitamin Ree at what times?
There's a highlight on my stories.
Okay.
That says virtual yoga.
You want to come pitch it?
Sure.
Real fast, little quick break from the
Y'all
World
are
War I stuff.
welcome, all levels. I mean all levels. Like, you could have never done yoga before, and it will be fine.
What if they don't have a mat?
That's also fine. You can use your carpet. But if you go to my Instagram page, there's a little highlight that says virtual yoga. It's the first one. Just click it, and it's the schedule for the week, and y'all can just come. And it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. So
And I make very bad jokes the entire time.
And I don't yoga, so don't expect to see me there.
He does not yoga. He will not be there.
Nope. He
Maybe
will
that's
not.
a perk.
Oh my god, my hair is so long.
Okay.
Gross.
Bye. Have fun.
Love you. All right, anyway, so let's get back into World War I a little bit after that shameless yoga plug. Now, anyway, and as you can see, this is World War I, right? Very, very intense battle scenes. This guy is jumping clean over one of these trenches. This right here is a British trench. As you can see, it's not very well made. Like I said, the German trenches were much, much more well fortified with like wooden floors and all this other stuff. And then that right there, ooh, is that going to be a German? I think that's a French trench. And this is like what life was like in the trenches, which we're going to talk about in the next flip. We're going to talk about life in the trenches, just so you can connect to our characters a little bit. You can see their experiences, kind of start to begin to understand them. I really think something you should focus on while you're reading this is try to create that good mental image of all these characters and what you think they look like. Like, I know my image in my mind, and this, of course, this is the Maxim machine gun in action, the thing that caused all of this trench warfare-like stuff. I know for a fact that my image in my mind of what I think Paul looks like is not actually historically appropriate, but I still like it. I always imagine that he's got like really, really like shaved close sides of his head, kind of longer on top, right? Kind of like a very like aggressive looking guy. Reminds me a little bit of Brad Pitt from Fury, all right? So if you've ever seen the movie Fury, it's about World War II. That's what I imagine Paul looks like, even though I know that's not accurate. It's just what I see when I like read that book, and this will now be probably my 20th time reading it with y'all. So anyway, but this is going to be where the Western Front is, and then here's the Eastern Front over towards Russia. Now, the Eastern Front, like we said earlier, is not home to a lot of this different intense trench warfare stuff that you're going to see out in the West, mainly just because the Eastern Front's too big. The Eastern Front is almost twice the length of the Western Front. I want to download TBS. Yeah, we do have friends on TBS. Maybe I will download that. All right, anyway, so it's like twice the length. So you don't have the same, you can't cover the same amount of space in that on that front as you would like. And so you don't have enough, if you're covering that much more space, you can't dig as many trenches. And it also, sometimes it's too cold. Permafrost will actually prevent people from digging into the dirt because the fronts towards Poland and Russia are going to be frozen for a large part of the year. Now, the Ottomans are going to join the Central Powers in 1914 as this war continues to progress. And the main reason why they join it because they have certain trade routes down towards the towards Constantinople. The thing that Constantinople sits on right there is the Strait of the Dardanelles, all right, the Dardanelles Strait, and they wanted to protect those trade routes because they were a dying empire, and it was one of the only things still bringing them money in their Black Sea trade routes. See, right here, that the Dardanelles Straits are right through here. That's Constantinople right there, and as you can see, all of Europe is now pretty much at war. And this is going to result in a huge, massive stalemate, unfortunately. Do I have... No, we don't have enough time to talk about all that. So, we're going to go ahead and cut it right there, okay? And we will talk about the stalemated war on Wednesday. And we'll get into how this war continues to progress, because this is kind of like an overlying themed explanation of how this war started, what it looked like, stuff like that, and just getting into the Schlieffen Plan and the two-front war situation. But we'll talk about this some more on Wednesday. Go ahead and read Chapter 2 in preparation for Wednesday, and I'll see you guys then. Y'all have a good one.